Battle of Trasimene. In the first battle, famous General Hannibal of the ancient kingdom of Carthage defeated the Romans so badly that they were too scared to fight him for an entire year afterwards. It's 218 BC, and the Roman Republic is at war with the kingdom of Carthage. The Carthaginians think they've figured out Rome's weakness. You see, Rome's power relied on its network of allies, who were really just tribes or city-states bullied into unfair treaties in exchange for military protection, and not getting destroyed. Since that's not exactly a healthy way to make friends, the leaders of Carthage figured that the allies might betray Rome if given a good enough reason. They send over their top general Hannibal with an army to win some battles against Roman forces, hoping the allies will see that Rome can be beaten and switch sides. Hannibal's soldiers have to cross tough passages and fight along the way, but eventually manage to reach Italy. In early May of 217 BC, they end up around here. Hannibal knows that there's a Roman army nearby and decides to provoke it into a fight. Conveniently, there are a bunch of villages around to loot and destroy, which means free food and free provocation. As the Carthaginians go about their business, the nearby Roman army, led by a consul named Gaius Flaminius, starts pursuing them. Hannibal realizes they're being followed and begins to lead his army south. To the Romans, it looks like Hannibal is running away. In reality, he wants to fight. He's just looking for a place that gives him the best chances. Remember that Hannibal is on an important mission, and while the Romans have multiple armies, he only has one, so he really can't afford to lose the impending battle and needs to take every advantage he can get. As he's thinking about these things, his army reaches Lake Trasimene. The narrow road they're on runs along the northern shore of the lake and leads them to the east, until it takes a turn south. To their left, there are wooded hills that are a couple dozen meters high. Seeing this, Hannibal comes up with a plan. When the Carthaginians reach the turn on the eastern side of the road, they set up their camp there shortly before nightfall. They make this no secret from the Romans, who are already in sighting distance. Meanwhile, the Romans are fuming. They've been marching through the destroyed villages and can't wait to take revenge. In fact, their leader Flaminius is so furious that even though he's being told by his advisors that he should stay calm and wait for reinforcements, he decides to attack right away. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. The Roman army sets out for Hannibal's camp the next morning. They were likely walking in 3 lines with some light infantry in the front. This was usual for the time, and the idea was that once they met the enemy, the frontal infantry would protect the main army behind them until it could arrange itself in a proper battle formation. Expecting this, the Romans are confident as their leading soldiers reach Hannibal's camp and make contact with the Carthaginians. Yet to their horror, they hear battle signals not from their front, but their flank and rear. As Hannibal's army starts charging, Flaminius's soldiers realize they've been trapped. Since they're getting attacked on their exposed sides, they have no chance to form a battle line in time. It turns out Hannibal just made it look like he stopped at the camp. In reality, he took a turn to the right and led the main part of his army back behind the hills. There, they had assumed an ambush position, where they waited up to this moment. While the infantry comes storming from the side, the cavalry attacks at the back, cutting off any enemies trying to escape. The Romans are completely caught off guard while their commander is just freaking out and not being of any help whatsoever. The surprise quickly turns into panic, and many Romans end up fleeing into the lake and drown. Some of the mentally tougher ones combine into small clusters and kind of put up a fight, but it's just not enough. The soldiers at the front manage to break through and flee, but are also caught by the Carthaginians a couple of hours later. In the end, the Carthaginians lose around 1,500 of their 50,000 men, while around half of the 30,000 Romans fall, and the other half are taken prisoner. The defeat came as an absolute shock to Rome. The people were panicking, and the Senate resembled a chicken den. They quickly appointed a new dictator who would then not go into battle with Hannibal for his entire term in fear of losing again. Instead, he opted for poking and prodding the Carthaginians with tactics like scorching the ground and small attacks, which mostly let Hannibal ravage and plunder as he pleased. Battle of Cowpens. The next battle really shows how knowing your enemy can give you a decisive advantage. October 1780, South Carolina. The Revolutionary War has been going on for over 5 years now. The American patriots are fighting the British loyalists for independence from the crown. In the Carolinas, things aren't looking good for the Americans. They've suffered multiple back-to-back losses this year and are now at risk of losing the entire area to the loyalists. In addition, the whole place is a huge mess, especially the South Carolina backcountry. Here, most people supported the British at the start, but then those decided that the best way to win over the locals was by threatening and intimidating them. Obviously, this backfired, and the opinion on which army to side with became really split. This led to an extremely hostile environment, where the general population started fighting each other. Many joined militia groups and small raids and battles became the norm. To get a grip on the situation, Commander General George Washington of the Patriots appoints Officer Nathaniel Greene to take charge of the Southern Army Department. He in turn decides to split the army into two parts and gives a part of it to Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. His job is to cut British supply lines and mess with their operations in general, while also to encourage the locals and motivate them to join the resistance. The British commander Charles Cornwallis isn't a fan of this idea whatsoever and sends an army of his own after Morgan. They are led by a guy named Banastre Tarleton. While he is relatively young at 26, his career has been stellar so far, and he's already got multiple victories against the Americans under his belt. After an aggressive chase, Morgan finds himself at a dead end on January 17, 1781. If he wants to retreat further, he will need to cross the overflowing Broad River, which would be extremely difficult and dangerous, so he decides to take up the fight instead. The situation isn't great. Tarleton's force is rapidly approaching, and he's commanding some of the best troops in the British Army. With their current string of defeats, the Continentals really can't afford another. But instead of panicking, Morgan calmly assesses the situation. They are at the Cowpens pasture, a meadow surrounded by trees and low hills throughout. In terms of manpower, sources aren't quite consistent, but the most common assumption is that Morgan had around 1,000 men at his disposal, while Tarleton had 1,150. Morgan's weakness is his relatively high share of less trained local militia that had joined his army, around 450 men. Previous battles had shown that those troops were prone to fleeing when the battle started to look unfavorable. In addition to those, he has around 450 well-trained militia and Continental infantry, as well as 125 cavalrymen. Tarleton has generally more professional troops, with around 300 cavalry and 800 infantry. Morgan also knows Tarleton's overconfident and aggressive character. Using all this knowledge, he comes up with a plan. Meanwhile, Tarleton keeps his troops going relentlessly. He can't wait to finally get to Morgan and gives his men no breaks. In the last 48 hours, they've had no food and only around 4 hours of sleep. Tarleton would soon learn that this kind of treatment would come at a price. The Brits finally reach Cowpens and see two lines of Americans. Tarleton takes a deep breath, organizes some scouts to investigate the Continental deployment, and calmly thinks about what kind of strategy he should employ. Just kidding. He immediately orders his men to attack, without even waiting for the rest of his army to come out of the woods. The first line of Continentals consists of around 150 sharpshooters that start firing at the approaching Brits and start moving back towards the second line. They're mainly targeting British officers since taking them out will make it harder for the enemies to organize later. Eventually, they reach the second line, consisting of the less trained militia. They fire 2 volleys and keep moving backwards. To the British, it seems like the Americans are retreating, which just agitates them more to keep going. As they're moving up a hill, a third line of skilled Continental soldiers appears on top. Luring the British here while exhausting them had been the plan all along. Under the cover of the third line, the second line of soldiers retreats to the right. Tarleton sends the skilled and feared dragoons after them. For a moment, it looks the Continental militia could suffer serious losses. But then Morgan's own cavalry appears from behind a second hill and manages to fight the dragoons off. Meanwhile, on the main battlefield, a little mishap happens on the American side. The men on the right flank are ordered to turn and face an incoming flanking attack, but the order is overheard and they start retreating. It turns out this was a blessing in disguise, because at this point, the British just lose it. They had been pursuing the Americans for too long. They've had almost no food and no sleep for days, and now with their enemies retreating, they are so close to victory. They break their formation and start charging uncontrollably. This is what Morgan had been waiting for. The Americans abruptly start a counterattack, and the British just cannot deal with it. They had been fully convinced that they were the attacking side with the Americans fleeing and just can't mentally adapt. To make matters worse, Morgan's cavalry appears on the right, while the militia that previously retreated now come charging from the left. So what do the British do? Most just start surrendering and fleeing. Those who remain cannot put up a fight against the now overwhelming force, and Tarleton is forced to retreat. In the end, the Continentals lose about 150 men, while around 870 of the British are captured or fatally wounded. What's interesting to me is how many parallels this battle has with the Battle of Trasimene. Do you see any? Here's the ones I found. Let me know in the comments if you've noticed anything else. Battle of Mikatagahara. The next battle really shows how even in desperate situations, there are opportunities to turn things around. Japan, 16th century. We're in the Sengoku period. Everyone's fighting for power over the country. For context, from the late 12th to 19th century, Japan was ruled through the shogunate system, where a military warlord called shogun held all the actual political power, while the emperor was just a symbolic figure. The shogun used local warlords called daimyo to rule the country, who would be subordinate to him in exchange for land and power. But during the Sengoku period, the then ruling Ashikaga shogunate had lost a lot of its authority, and the daimyo were rebelling and fighting each other, basically making the country a big free-for-all. Eventually, one daimyo named Nobunaga Oda manages to rise above everyone else and makes good progress to unify the country. By 1573, he had established himself as the de facto leader of the country. But not everyone likes that. Another warlord, Takeda Shingen, is part of an alliance against Oda and is leading an army of 35,000 men towards him. On his way, he needs to pass an ally of Oda named Tokugawa Ieyasu, based at Hamamatsu Castle. Now, Takeda isn't actually interested in fighting Tokugawa and would much rather conserve his forces for Oda. But when advised to just let Takeda pass, Tokugawa isn't having any of it. This is even though he only has around 11,000 men at his disposal and is a massive underdog in a battle. So he faces Takeda's forces at the Mikatagahara Plateau. You might be wondering, how does he use deception to win this battle? How does he manage to overcome the much stronger enemy? Well, he doesn't. He actually gets overwhelmed pretty decisively. But hold on, I promise I didn't quite clickbait you, because Tokugawa still has some tricks up his sleeve. After he had retreated to the castle, some of his men were still out there fighting. To convince them to retreat, he swings the castle gates wide open, sets up lights, and beats a war drum. When Takeda's commanders see this, they assume it's a trap, and instead of attacking the castle, they decide to camp for the night. They could have just walked in and crushed the small remainder of Tokugawa's resistance, but there's no way he had left the gates open without some hidden army or trap, right? At this point, your average warlord wouldn't believe his luck and would probably try to make a run for it. But instead, Tokugawa decides to double down. After all, if something worked once, it might work again. So in the night, he gathers around 100 men and counterattacks the Takeda camp. Takeda's leaders are confused. Didn't we defeat them? Why are they attacking us? I guess they have more men than we thought and reinforcements coming, because there's no way they'd attack us with the few men they've got left, right? On top of that, they're still trying to conserve their force for Oda, and so Tokugawa's bluff works again. Even though he could easily crush the attackers, Takeda decides to withdraw his army. Now, don't get me wrong, the whole affair was still a great loss for Tokugawa, usually considered the worst defeat in his career. But making Takeda retreat still proved to be extremely valuable, as he would be fatally wounded in another battle before he could attack Hamamatsu again. Oda continued to thrive, and eventually Tokugawa himself would become the next shogun, with his shogunate lasting over 250 years.